The prairie was quiet, save for the low whistle of wind across the scrub and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. The rancher was riding the fence line at dusk, checking for breaks where cattle might wander. He had long ago gotten used to the silence. It was the only company he had left since burying his wife 3 winters past. Folks in town called him a steady man, the kind who spoke little, worked hard, and never complained. But that evening, the silence broke. Down along the wash, he spotted a horse staggering beneath the weight of its rider. The animal's legs trembled, foam on its mouth, eyes rolling white. The rider, slumped forward, clung to the saddle horn with hands barely alive. The rancher kicked his mount into a gallop, dust flying as he closed the distance. The stranger toppled just as he reached him. "Easy there," the rancher muttered, pulling the man's limp body clear of the horse. Blood stained his shirt, a deep crimson spreading across his ribs. His face was gaunt, skin waxy, lips cracked from thirst. The stranger's eyes flickered open for a moment, just long enough to rasp one word. "Luke." And then he went still. The rancher hauled him onto his own horse and rode hard for the cabin. Inside, the dim firelight flickered across rough-hewn walls as he laid Luke down on the bed. He tore open the shirt, finding a bullet wound just under the ribs, ugly, but not fresh. The man had been carrying it for days. The rancher cleaned it with boiled water, stitched it as best he could, and pressed strips of cloth tight against the wound. He gave the man sips of water between fits of unconsciousness, though each swallow seemed a battle. Through the night, he sat at the bedside, listening to Luke's ragged breathing. The storm outside lashed against the shutters, but inside, it was the slow tick of the clock and the occasional groan of pain that filled the cabin. By dawn, the rancher had done all he could. Whether Luke Jensen lived or died was now up to something greater. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at his eyelids. He figured his part was done. He'd taken in a stranger, tended his wounds, done his Christian duty. By evening, he told himself, he would bury a man he never knew, mark the grave with stones, and go on with his quiet life. But life on the frontier had a way of twisting simple acts into fateful turns. The rancher didn't know it yet, but by saving one man, he had set the course for something much bigger. Luke Jensen wasn't just a dying drifter. And soon, the rancher would find out just how many people, and how much trouble, came riding in the shadow of that name. The stranger's eyes flickered open for a moment, just long enough to rasp one word. "Luke." And then he went still. The rancher hauled him onto his own horse and rode hard for the cabin. Inside, the dim firelight flickered across rough-hewn walls as he laid Luke down on the bed. He tore open the shirt, finding a bullet wound just under the ribs, ugly, but not fresh. The man had been carrying it for days. The rancher cleaned it with boiled water, stitched it as best he could, and pressed strips of cloth tight against the wound. He gave the man sips of water between fits of unconsciousness, though each swallow seemed a battle. Through the night, he sat at the bedside, listening to Luke's ragged breathing. The storm outside lashed against the shutters, but inside, it was the slow tick of the clock and the occasional groan of pain that filled the cabin. By dawn, the rancher had done all he could. Whether Luke Jensen lived or died was now up to something greater. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at his eyelids. He figured his part was done. He'd taken in a stranger, tended his wounds, done his Christian duty. By evening, he told himself, he would bury a man he never knew, mark the grave with stones, and go on with his quiet life. But life on the frontier had a way of twisting simple acts into fateful turns. The rancher didn't know it yet, but by saving one man, he had set the course for something much bigger. Luke Jensen wasn't just a dying drifter. And soon, the rancher would find out just how many people, and how much trouble, came riding in the shadow of that name. The rancher had barely caught an hour's rest when the sound of hooves shattered the early morning calm. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, scanning the horizon. The sun was just crawling over the ridge, painting the land in red and gold, but what drew his eye wasn't the sunrise. 4 riders crested the rise. Not men. Women. Each sat tall in the saddle, their silhouettes sharp against the sky. Dust clung to their coats, pistols strapped to their hips, rifles across their saddlebags. They weren't the kind of women who came looking for charity. They rode with the hard edges of people who had seen violence and lived to tell it. The lead rider swung down first, a striking woman with auburn hair tied back under a wide-brimmed hat. She moved like someone used to command, her eyes hard but not cruel. Behind her came a dark-eyed woman with a scar across her cheek, followed by a quiet blonde who carried her rifle like it was part of her body. The last was the youngest, no more than 19, her jaw set with stubborn defiance. The rancher tightened his grip on the rifle but didn't raise it. "You're a long way from town," he said evenly. The auburn-haired woman's gaze flicked toward the cabin door, where Luke Jensen lay inside. "We're exactly where we need to be." Her words carried weight. The rancher's stomach knotted. Upon his land, they had come for Luke. He stepped down from the porch, boots crunching in the dirt. "Man's half dead. Took a bullet days ago." "You know him?" The scarred woman spat in the dust. "Know him? We've bled beside him." She jerked her chin toward the cabin. "Luke Jensen's no common drifter. He's our partner. And if he's here, that means trouble's close behind." The youngest spoke up then, her voice sharp with challenge. "Where is he?" The rancher hesitated. Every instinct told him to keep these women outside, keep them away from the stranger in his bed. But the look in their eyes, fierce, loyal, unyielding, told him one thing plain as day: they weren't leaving without him. He finally motioned toward the cabin. "Inside. But keep your hands off your irons. I won't have gunplay under my roof." The women exchanged glances, then strode past him, boots echoing against the wooden floorboards as they entered. From his chair, Luke stirred, coughing weakly as the women crowded around him. His lips cracked into the faintest smile. "Clara. May. Josie. Ruth," he rasped, naming them one by one. "Told you I'd find a way back." The rancher watched in silence. He didn't yet know who these women were, or what storm was riding on their heels. But he knew this much: his quiet ranch life was gone. That night, the cabin felt smaller than ever. The storm outside rattled the shutters, but the storm inside was worse: 5 strangers under one roof, all armed, all hiding something. Caleb sat at the table, his rifle within arm's reach, a steaming pot of coffee between them. Across from him, the women flanked Luke's sickbed like sentries, refusing to let him out of their sight. The fire crackled, throwing shadows across their faces. "Seems to me," Caleb began slowly, "a man doesn't draw this much company unless he's carrying more than a bullet in his side." Clara, the auburn-haired leader, leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. Her eyes locked on his, sharp and steady. "Luke Jensen isn't what you think. He's not some drifter who picked a fight he couldn't finish." "Then what is he?" Caleb asked. May, the scarred woman, gave a bitter laugh. "He's the one fool stubborn enough to cross Silas Red." The name hit Caleb like a hammer. Silas Red, cattle thief, extortionist, and the kind of outlaw who set fire to a ranch just to watch families run. Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd heard whispers of Red's gang pushing further west, leaving ruin behind them. Clara's voice lowered, steady but laced with fire. "Red planned to burn out another homestead, a family with kids, nothing but dirt to their name. Luke found out and said no. Red doesn't take no kindly." Caleb's gaze flicked to Luke, pale and sweating in the bed. "So you broke from him?" Josie, the quiet blonde, finally spoke, her words soft but edged with steel. "Not just him. The 4 of us rode with Luke. Red called us his pretty ornaments, but we weren't his. We fought beside Luke. And when Luke turned his gun on Red, so did we. Ruth, the youngest, crossed her arms. That's why he wants us dead. Every last one. Silence settled heavy over the room. Caleb stared at them, four women bound by loyalty, carrying the weight of choices that would mark them for life. He'd taken in strays before, hungry hands needing bread. But this wasn't charity. This was war being dragged to his doorstep. Red won't forget, Caleb said finally, his voice low. If Luke's here, he'll come hunting. Clara met his gaze without flinching. Then you'd best decide quick, Rancher. Are you with us, or do we take Luke and ride on before he breathes his last? The fire popped, throwing sparks up the chimney. Caleb's hands tightened around his coffee mug. He hadn't asked for this fight. But watching Luke's chest rise shallow, seeing the unyielding defiance in the women's eyes, he realized the choice was already made. No one dies under my roof, Caleb said. Not without me standing in the way. The women exchanged glances, and for the first time since they arrived, Clara allowed the smallest nod of respect. The storm outside howled. Inside, a new alliance had been forged in firelight. The first light of dawn barely touched the plains when the riders appeared. The rancher spotted them from the porch, black dots cresting the ridge, the faint glint of rifles catching the rising sun. 20 men at least. The kind of force meant to crush a single homestead like a boot to an ant. They've found us, Clara muttered, tightening her belt as she stepped outside, rifle slung across her shoulder. Luke, pale but stubborn, pushed himself upright against the doorframe. His hand trembled, but his voice was steady. That's Red's brand on those horses. He's brought his pack. The rancher's jaw hardened. The time for hesitation was gone. Then we make them pay for every inch of this land, he said. The women moved with swift, practiced precision. Josie climbed the ladder to the hayloft, laying out her rifle across the narrow window slit. Ruth dragged a row of oil-soaked barrels along the fence line, striking flint until the stench of smoke rose in the cold air. May, quiet but ruthless, uncoiled spools of wire across the main approach, stringing them low to the ground where charging horses wouldn't see until too late. Clara checked the rancher's old shotgun, handing it over with a smirk. Time to see if you're still as good as you claim, Rancher. The thunder of hooves rolled across the plains. Silas Red himself rode at the front, tall in the saddle, scarred jaw catching the light. He raised his hand, and his men fanned out like wolves. Bring me Jensen, his voice boomed. Kill the rest. The charge came swift and brutal. May's wire trap snapped first, horses screamed, stumbling headlong into the dirt as riders toppled. Gunfire cracked, Josie's rifle striking true from the loft, dropping men before they could lift their pistols. The barrels along the fence went up in a wall of fire, the smoke choking and blinding the charge. The rancher stood firm on the porch, shotgun booming with every pull. He dropped one man, then another, his shoulders steady as if he'd been waiting years for a fight like this. Clara fought at his side, her rifle speaking sharp and sure, each shot placed with deadly calm. The yard became a storm of smoke, fire, and lead. Men screamed, horses reared, bullets thudded into wood and earth. Ruth darted through the chaos with uncanny speed, reloading weapons and shoving ammo into waiting hands. Silas himself cut through the smoke, pistol in one hand, saber in the other, a demon on horseback. His eyes found Luke on the porch and narrowed with hate. But before he could strike, Josie's rifle cracked once more. Silas staggered, his saber clattering into the dust. A heartbeat later, the rancher's shotgun roared, and the outlaw leader crashed from his horse in a heap. The fight broke with him. Red's men scattered, scrambling for the hills, leaving their fallen where they lay. For a long moment, the ranch lay silent, broken only by the crackle of fire and the ragged breathing of survivors. The rancher lowered his shotgun, smoke curling from the barrels. His land was still standing. Barely. And for the first time, the women weren't just strangers under his roof. They were his allies, bound in blood and battle. The rancher sat on the porch, bruised but alive. His shirt was torn, his knuckles raw, and his ribs ached from the fight. Dust still clung to his boots, the aftermath of the gun battle that had nearly burned his world to the ground. Beside him, Luke, pale and bandaged, leaned against the railing with a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Guess I owe you more than a meal," Luke rasped, voice hoarse but steady. The rancher gave a small nod, though his eyes lingered on the horizon where the last of Silas Red's men had fled. Trouble might come back someday. Trouble always did out here, but for now, the land was quiet. He half expected the women to ride off once the dust cleared. They were fighters, not settlers, women who had lived by the gun and the grit of survival. But they didn't leave. Instead, they stayed. By the next morning Clara was hammering new boards across the bullet-pocked walls. May was out in the pasture, steadying the cattle that had scattered in the night, moving with the ease of someone who knew animals better than people. Josie climbed back into the loft, rifle balanced across her knees, determined to keep watch until every shadow felt safe again. And Ruth, sleeves rolled, scrubbed bloodstains from the porch with quiet determination, as though she was already making the place her own. Days turned into weeks. The silence that had once pressed heavy over the rancher's home now carried the sounds of work, laughter, and sometimes argument. The long, empty suppers by lamplight were replaced with crowded tables, full plates, and voices that made the old house feel alive again. The women filled every corner with presence, and the rancher, who had long believed loneliness was his lot, found himself unsettled, but in a way that eased something deep inside him. One evening, as the sun burned low over the plains, Clara came to stand beside him at the fence. Her face was lit with the fading glow, her eyes thoughtful as they swept across the land they had defended together. "You didn't ask for company," she said softly, not quite looking at him. The rancher chuckled, the sound low and rough. "No. But maybe it's what I needed." And so it was. From then on, the ranch was never just his. Folks in town would whisper for years about the time a dying stranger brought 4 fearless women to stay, and how they changed a rancher's life forever.